Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back. This week, we're going to get our little treasure chest populated with a whole bunch of gems and coins and goblets, and just generally fill our treasure chest with our pirate treasure. Hopefully, everyone has done a good job in creating the model and the UVs for their treasure chest. For those of you that are participating and publishing all of your work onto the forums, great job. I've been looking at your stuff, and everyone is proceeding quite nicely through this course. If you haven't yet decided to jump onto the forums and participate in our community, please do so. I think you're going to find that the responses and the comments and the critiques that you get on your work are only going to help your own personal and professional development. So jump in, participate. It's a tremendous amount of fun, and that way we all can enjoy from our successes and learn from our failures. Okay, let's just go ahead and jump in. So this week what we're going to do is that we're going to open up our chest and we're going to start putting some pirate treasure on the inside of our pirate chest. Before we go any further though, it's really important going forward that the scale, the size of our treasure chest be dialed in and be precisely where we want it to be. So I want to look at the size of my treasure chest by going to the top of the screen and choosing the View pull-down menu. Check it out. We have this Dimensions tool. And this will tell us the global dimensions, the actual size of our little treasure chest. And mine is itty bitty. If you zoom in and take a look at it, mine's 6.7 inches, and that's what the little double quotes mean down there at the end. Now, if you're seeing something else, if you're seeing your measurements show up as metric, let me show you where to change it. We can change our unit of measurement system inside of Modo really easy by going to the global Modo preferences. So at the top of the screen, I'll choose Modo. And on a Mac, it's right here at the top inside of preferences. And where we're going is down here into the input category. So here's the input category of options, and then units. As you can see from the top of this list, the first units that we get to change is this right here. So these are all of our distance units. Excuse me. You might be in a standard, imperial, or metric. I'm in English, just because that's how my brain works at the moment. Everything's in feet and inches for me. So that's where you go to change this if you want to get it into a scale system that you're used to working within. So I can already see that my little dude here is much too small. It's only 6 inches tall, so I need to make this much bigger. I want this to be about 36 inches tall. So I'll go to my Action Center, put it at Origin, fire off the Scale tool, and note that I'm doing this in my polygonal mode. And I'm just going to make this big. The great thing about that Dimensions tool is that it's live. Now it's telling me the height of my treasure chest is about 13 inches, and I'm going to keep dialing this up until I'm relatively happy with its overall size and scale. You're going to find that everything going forward is going to be very dependent on the size and understanding the size of our object. So I've gone too far. 36 inches, right around there. That's close enough. It's not super precise, but that's actually a little bit too big. I thought it said 36. It says 3 feet 6 inches. Let's only return to that, make it a little bit smaller. 3 feet 6 is not that bad, but in my mind, this is just about 3 feet tall. Somewhere right around and there. I'm very pleased with that. And now this is looking exactly the way I want it to look. Okay, let me turn off the Dimensions tool and we'll get started. Now I need to open up my little treasure chest here, and it'd be great in the animation that the entire movement of my treasure chest really kind of reside and center themselves around maybe these little pins that I've created in the back. So I'm going to go to my top item and begin to work with the polygons for this element. As you know, animation resides at the item level, and now that I'm in item mode, I can fire off the Y key, and let me change my Action Center to off, and my symmetry also to off, and check it out. At the item level, when I click on that item with Item Transform tool active, you can see precisely where the center point for that object is. Another great way of viewing your center point is to hit the O key, go into the Visibility section, and then right here where it says Show Centers, let's turn that to Selected. And if I select my top element, there it is. There's the center point right down there at the origin of the scene. The default location for all center points is the origin, so please keep that in mind. Okay, now that we know where our center point is, let's get it to the location that we want. I need to move my center point from down here into the middle of these two hinges in the back. So right in where my cursor is, right in there. And there's a number of ways we can do this. Of course, we're more than welcome to go in and manually do it, but there's a better way. And let me show you how to do it. It's really easy and very quick. It's going to involve us going into the Setup tab. So we'll go up here at the top. Of course, we've been hanging out in the Model and the UV tab. Now let's go to the Setup tab, because the Setup tab is going to allow us to do this operation very quickly. So initially, I want to change my selection set to polygons, and I'm going to start selecting some polys. I'm going to go to each side of the hinge here, and then hit the L key for loop, And I want the computer to analyze the loops that I've selected and put the center point of my scene. So I'm going to move my work plane to the middle of my selection, which is going to be pretty cool. At the top of the screen, we have this work plane pull-down menu. Fire it off, and we're going to align the work plane to the selection. Now, without the work plane's visibility on, it doesn't look like we've done anything. So with the O key active, I've gone into my visibility tab, and I'm just going to choose show work plane, and there it is. There's the location of my work plane. Now, I generally don't like to have my work plane on, not because I don't think it's necessary. Actually, I think it's the most important modeling feature inside of Modo. It just often visually kind of gets in the way of me seeing my little perfect model here, my sculpture. So I'm going to turn another option on under the work plane pull-down menu. This is draw axis. This is going to show us the local orientation of the XYZ axis on the work plane itself. And this is a nice little handy-dandy little thing to have on, especially if you're used to having the work plane's visibility deactivated. Now I can see precisely where the center of my work plane is. I want the center point for my top item to go directly to the center point of my work plane, which looks to be exactly where I want. I've returned to the item mode, and I've selected the top of my treasure chest. And with that selected, you can see the center point way down over here. Now, here's a cool trick. If you immediately go into the centers selection set, the top mesh item will still stay selected. But now I can just drag out a marquee selection box with my right mouse button and grab that center point. I know it's selected because the white disk on the interior of each one of these XYZ indicator lines is orange. With the center point selected, I can cruise over to my setup tools found inside of the setup tab up here at the top of our vertical collection of tools. And where we're going is down here to work plane position. So we're going to set the center point to the work plane position. Now notice that this is just the position. It didn't change the orientation, the rotation of the center point. If you want to do that, you're more than welcome, because there's also a 2 work plane rotation. For me, I'm just going to keep it on work plane position. I'm a happy camper. Let's reset the location of our work plane. So whenever you align it to a custom piece of geometry, after you're finished moving things, the next thing you got to do is reset the work plane, because almost every single tool and almost every single function inside of Modo works off of the local orientation and position of the work plane. There we go. I've reset it. You can see that the axes indicators for my work plane have returned to the origin of the scene, and I'm also going to deactivate the visibility of my axes. Okay, now life is good. With the top item selected, let's go over and check out the properties, the transform properties for that item. Because now that I've moved my work plane, all those movement values have been preserved and saved in the item list. Now I don't want this location and that value to represent the default, or kind of like the bind pose or the resting pose for the top of the lid. I want these to be 0. So I want to zero out all the transforms for the position values for this item. I can go down here where it says 0, and I'm just going to choose position. Boom. Now, all those values have been reset back to 0, and we're ready to rock and roll. Okay, cool. Now, in item mode, I can grab it, fire off the item transform tool, which is the Y key, and I can rotate my lid open like that. This is going to be a handy-dandy little setup function for our lid. It's going to allow us to open and close our lid with ease and not have to think about the pivot point and where it's rotating around. And it absolutely coincides and works perfectly with the structures that I've already created in the back. It makes it look like it's actually rotating around the hinges, which in my opinion is mission accomplished. Okay. Now that we have our lid open, let's look at how we can use the rest of the dynamics engine inside of Modo to get the type of result that we're after and to fill our treasure chest with some pirate gold. To get all of our pirate gold inside the treasure chest, we're going to use the dynamics engine to have it automatically fill and populate the interior of our treasure chest with the mesh items that we want. Now, let's look at my item list here for a second, because I've given you guys 2 additional models this week that we'll want to look at. I'm going to turn off my treasure chest, and I have this coin low, which we'll talk about next week, in particular when we talk about texture and normal mapping and baking. This is actually going to be the piece of pirate gold that's going to go on the inside. And I've also given you guys this fun little goblet. Now, each one of these were modeled inside of their own separate independent project files, and then I combine them into my master project file just by dragging and dropping them from one area into another. However, if you take a look at the scale of both these elements, they're wildly different. And if we turn our treasure chest back on, you can see that we have some work that we need to do. And this is why working inside of a consistent system of scale is so critically important, and why at a certain point within your production pipeline, you have to commit to scale. And I'm at that point. I need to start placing these elements on the inside, so it's absolutely critical that I place them at the correct scale in relationship to my treasure chest and each other. Let's start off with the goblet, because the goblet's just absolutely ginormous. If you've done a good job, and if you've modeled all of your objects at the origin of the scene, making these global changes is really, really easy. I've changed my selection set over to polygons, and I'm going to change my action center to origin, and I'm simply just going to scale this bad boy down until I'm happy with the overall size of this little goblet, which is maybe, I don't know, right in there or so. If you wanted to get a little bit more specific, you certainly could go in, fire off the scale, or excuse me, the show dimensions tool, and let's see, that's about 12 inches. That's about a foot tall. That's maybe a little bit bigger than it needs to be. So let's scale it down a little bit more. Maybe we'll scale it down to about, I don't know, somewhere right around in there. That's pretty good. And now I'll have a couple little goblets that I can place inside of my treasure chest. Same goes for my coin. Let's do the coin real fast. My action center is still at origin. Rock and roll. I can grab this element, scale it down to the approximate size that I want. Now, to make it a little bit easier to see what's going on inside of this this next step when we're working with it, I'm going to make my coin probably a little bit bigger than it needs to be. It's going to almost feel like a plate or a saucer, and I'm doing that intentional just so it's a little bit easier for you guys at home to physically see the results and the impact of this next step of integrating the dynamics engine into the treasure chest itself. So I know it's big. It looks weird. If, you know, in the final render, you'll see that my little coins are going to be much, much smaller. They're going to be the size of about like a $50 probably. Okay, so pretty big, but not definitely 3 inches in diameter. That's a little bit too big. They'll probably be about 1.5 inches in diameter. Okay, let's go ahead and deactivate the dimensions tool and start working on getting everything in. Now, this is going to seem like an interesting process because what we're going to do is that we're going to add a whole bunch of dynamic elements that will help us very quickly to get to the final result that we're after. Because what we want to do, or what I'm doing, and what my creative brain is telling me to do, is that I want to put a whole bunch of gold coins on the interior of my treasure chest. But I want to place them in a way that makes it look like they're organic, to make it look like they were poured into the treasure chest. So I need probably about 100 of these coins, and I tell you what, I am not very interested in the idea of individually placing about 100 separate pieces. I'm sitting in front of a gigantic thinking machine, a computer. I'd much rather have the computer figure out where to place all these coins for me. So I have to do a little bit of setup in the dynamics engine to get the result that I want. This is going to seem like wasted work because we're eventually going to delete all of these dynamic elements from the scene, but ultimately the conclusion, what we are going to yield from this, is a point cloud that's going to be extraordinarily editable and give us the result, the organic kind of poured in result that we're after. So just bear with me, and once you see it, once you see the method to the madness, I hope you'll understand. Let's go ahead and take a look at it real fast. It's not that complex. The first thing that we want to do to make my life a little bit easier as the user here is to start turning certain elements off. I've turned the top of my scene off. I'm also going to temporarily leave the bottom of my treasure chest active. Now, this bottom is probably, I don't know, maybe 90% Catmull-Clark subdivision surface. So I don't want to incorporate this into my dynamics engine because it's just going to completely, and I mean completely, bog down the system, and it's going to take forever for me to get a compelling result. So what I'm going to do as an alternative is to create a very simple, low-resolution version of my treasure chest just with a basic cube. So let's add a new mesh item into the mix. There we go. And let's turn off my coin and my goblet. And I think I'm just going to very quickly, looking at my scene from the top, just flush out a cube. Just something very simple. I only really care about maybe the top bit here. Grow it up a little bit, something like that. The proportions don't need to match precisely, okay? I mean, if you really, really wanted to, you certainly could, but I'm not going to, just to make it a little bit easier. Now we need to make this, bevel this in a little bit. And I'll hold down the shift key, click, and then move my action handles back down, maybe somewhere right around in there. Okay, so that's going to be my fictitious treasure chest that we're going to exclusively use for the dynamics engine. It does not have to be a perfect match. Let's name this. We'll name this bottom blank or bottom dynamics. There we go, just so we have an understanding that this bottom is only going to be used for the dynamic portion. With that said, we can turn the actual bottom mesh item off and begin our work. Okay, so what we want to do is that we want to use this cube here as a container, a fictitious container in which we will pour a whole bunch of coins and goblets into. It's a whole lot of fun, and it's going to allow us to incorporate a number of the dynamic systems into our scene. Now, the rest of this stage is going to be done at the item level, so I'll change my selection set over to item, as all dynamic elements and dynamic tags are going to be associated with an item. The first thing that we want to do is that we want to select the bottom dynamics, the bottom of our treasure chest, our fake bottom. And over here in our setup tab, down here at the bottom, we have a tab called Dynamics, and this is going to allow us to do any number of things, but what we want to initially do is tag this item with a certain dynamic kind of role. And what we want to do is that we want to do a kinematic rigid body. If we choose an active rigid body, this item is going to be influenced by the gravity within the scene, and we don't want that. We want this element to stay precisely where it's at. If we choose kinematic, the gravity is still going to be an influence on the objects inside of this object. Excuse me, let me rephrase that. This object is still going to be influenced by gravitational elements within inside the scene, but it's not going to move. It's going to stay in its current location. The other active elements are going to be able to bounce and be influenced by this little element. So I want to change this to a kinematic. There we go. And the moment we hit that kinematic body, a couple new things happen over here inside of our item list. We have our new solver. Now, this is the bullet time solver being applied to our scene. This solver is a global operator, and it's going to affect every single element that's been tagged with a dynamic element, so it is important. If we click on it and look at its properties, we can do some additional kind of tweaking to the physics if we want. This is also a great place to go and do some debugging if you're not quite too happy. This will turn on a small little green wireframe that will illustrate precisely what's going on. This advanced section is truly advanced. I'll let you guys continue to explore this, and if you have any questions, just pop into the forums. I'd be more than happy to explore. Now, specifically, the other thing that we need to do is influence how this solver, or change how this solver is being applied to our dynamic elements within inside the scene. I'm going to select my bottom dynamics base, and check it out. Now we have a new tab over here on the right called Dynamic, and we can change any number of properties. Now, the one that we want to change is the collision shape, because right now the collision shape is being set to the hull, so it's just like it's an outside box. It doesn't include that interior bevel that we did a minute ago. So we want to change our collision shape from hull to mesh. Now, luckily that this is just a simple cube. It's not too polygonally heavy. We want to be careful when we're choosing this mesh element, because on subdivision surfaces, it's not going to take the actual polygonal cage that's being presented to us. It's going to take the polygonal surface that the subdivision surface is creating upon render. So it's taking its subdivision rate, if you will, as the bounding box for all of this dynamic stuff. So it can get quite heavy very quickly when working with sub D objects. This, no problem. Okay, let's leave all these other elements at their defaults, okay? This is going to determine how bouncy it is. This is going to determine how sticky our object is, the friction. So actually, I kind of don't want it very bouncy. I'll turn this down just a little bit, and I'll turn my friction up to about 70 so my little coins and goblets can stick in there, okay? All right. So now that we have our little box inside of our scene, we need to create a particle system that will generate all the locations for our coins automatically for us. There are a number of fantastic ways that we can create particles inside of Modo. I'm going to do the really quick way and create a radial emitter and kind of spray out some particles within inside of my scene. To do that, we're going to go down, back over here into our setup tools. Here's our particle section, and we're going to choose radial emitter. Let's just click on it. It adds it to our scene. Not only did the radial emitter get added, but it also automatically added a particle simulation for us. Let's do some additions and some corrections to our radial emitter. I'm going to select it inside of my scene, and using the Y, the item transform key, I'm going to drag it up above my little box. There we go. Now, with it still selected, I need to change its angle, because right now the cone angle is at 180 degrees. Since we're working with the particle system now, let's take a look at these 3 green buttons at the bottom of our timeline. These 3 buttons are important because they're going to allow us to preview our simulation indefinitely. That's what this first one is. This next one is going to preview our simulation, but it's going to honor the sequence start and the sequence end frame range. So it's only going to give us a preview from frame 0 all the way over here to 120. And this last one is going to run the simulation based on the frame range that we set. So it's going to cache it automatically for us. These first 2 are previews. So this third one's going to cache it temporarily, and it will allow us to use the location of our playhead to show us the preview. So let me show you. Let me just hit this first button. And there we go. You can see that we're spraying out particles within inside the scene. Let me make it a little bit easier for you guys to see precisely what's going on. If I select my particle simulation from the item list, I can go down into my properties and let's change the color to a lovely shade of blue. And I'll also change the size to like 3, just so it's a little bit easier for you guys to see. There we go. Here, let's make the size to 5 because it's still pretty small. There we go. And now when I hit that first green arrow, yep, there's all my particles. Pretty cool. While we're in the same properties tab, let's return to our particle system properties and just enable use gravity. If we play our sim now, yeah, now all of our particles are being sprayed into our little container, which is exactly what we want. Okay, rock and roll. Now, I'm not too enthralled with the current location of this. Let's just bring it up ever so slightly. There we go. Wonderful. I think that's going to work. Now, the next thing that I want to do is get our particles to interact with the base of our treasure chest. Now, to do that, we're going to influence and use the schematic workspace down below. So this is actually really kind of cool. We can start adding any item that's inside of our item list into our schematic just by left-clicking on it and dragging it down into the schematic. There we go. And then when you get in here, this is a node. Notice that we have a number of inputs on the left side and then outputs on the right side. On this dynamics section, we have an input value here that's gold, which shows us that there is a connected item into this input. If we were to simply double-click on it, it will show us the input item for that channel, which in our case is that mesh. Okay. Let's get our radial emitter into the mix. Here's another great way of adding items that are currently existing in your item list into your schematic. You can select them here, and then check it out. In our schematic, we have a button right up here at the top called Add Selected, and it will automatically put it in. The output for our radial emitter has a little gold diamond, which means there's a connected element. There it goes, which is our particle simulation. The guys down at the Foundry have done a really great job, in my opinion, of communicating the flow of information from all these schematic nodes to each other. These little noodles here allow us to very quickly understand how items and channels are playing and working in harmony with each other. Okay, so enough about that. Let's keep going. Okay, so I have my particle simulation. Let's just play it. Nothing's real changed, and I want my particle simulation to interact with all the rigid bodies and the dynamic elements within inside of our scene. To do that, it's really, really easy. Just make sure your particle simulation is selected, and then we can return to our particle tools. This blue one here is called Dynamic Collider, and this is going to allow all of our particles to interact with dynamic elements. I double-clicked on the gold diamond, and you can see that this Dynamic Collider is connected to 2 things. It's an operator of the particle simulation, and it's also being influenced by the global dynamic solver inside of our scene. If we hit the play button now, yeah, check it out. Now we can see our little blue particles are bouncing and interacting with the surface of our treasure chest. Excellent. Okay, so let me stop everything, and we're marching closer and closer and closer to the result that we're after. So we've added the bottom of our treasure chest. We've created a dynamic element for that. We've added a particle system, and we've made the particles interact with those other dynamic elements within the scene. Now we need to start hooking in a replicator that we can use to duplicate all of our coins and goblets for us. It's very, very cool. The great thing about replicators is that they allow us to duplicate meshes very, very quickly and probably in its most simple and most efficient way inside the Modo rendering system. Items, so if we do instances or item duplications, are very heavy. There's a lot of information associated with an item. All the transform, the rotation, the scale, any number of channels can be applied to an item. Replicators, however, allow us to render a lot of detail mesh pieces very, very quickly and very, very efficiently. efficiently. It's actually kind of amazing how fast they render. So given the goal, the outcome, the yield of our little scene here, it makes sense that we duplicate all of our coins and our goblets with a replicator. So let's add one into the scene. It's really, really easy. You can add replicators a number of different ways. Of course, we can do it from the Add Item pull-down menu inside the item list. And there it is under Particles, and it's the first one in the list. Check it out. Cool. Check it out, however. If you're working inside the schematic, we can also go Add, Particles, Replicators. 6 to one, half a dozen to another. They get you the exact same thing. Now, replicators need two different things. They need a particle source, which is going to be our particle simulation, and they need a prototype. And a prototype is going to be the mesh item that is physically duplicated at the location of each one of the particles that's being fed into the system. So let's get our little coin in here. I'm going to drag and drop it down into my item list. There we go. And now I'm going to take the output, this little guy right here, of my coin and plug it into the prototype channel of my replicator. Okay, step one done. The next thing we need to do, as I mentioned before, is to define a particle source. And that's going to be the output of our particle simulation. Let's plug it into particle source, and we're on our way. Now let's see what we get here. Hit the play button. Yeah, cool, and it's working. However, we have a little bit of an interesting problem here, in that if you look very, very carefully, none of the replicated elements are being influenced by the other replicated elements. And I'm just going to stop it here real fast. And let's just cache and compute my simulations from 0 to 120. I'll take but a second here. And now, with that cached, I can use the location of my playhead to determine what I'm viewing. Okay, let's just take a look-see here. If you look very, very carefully, they're not really interacting with each other, and we're getting some interpenetration between all the different replicated particles, which isn't exactly what we want. The moment they're created inside the radial emitter, they should start being influenced by each other. We're not getting the result that we want. They're also not falling over, they're not stacking on top of each other, so we need to add a very special element into our mix, and it's called a dynamic collider. Okay, and a dynamic replicator. It's pretty easy to do, but it's a little hidden. So if we go to the Add Item pull-down menu, under Other, there it is, Dynamic Replicator. I misspoke. It's not a dynamic collider. It's a dynamic replicator. We'll add the dynamic replicator into the mix. I'll drag it down into my schematic, and you can see that it becomes an operator of our particle system. But there's a couple other things that we need to do. Specifically, if we look at it, we need to tell it which mesh item to include into its replication. This, in a sense, is going to create a dynamic tag for every instance or every replica that it creates. So I'm going to take the output of my coin and feed it into the prototype section. Okay, and the second thing that we need to do is that we need to take the output of our dynamic replicator and we need to hook it in to the dynamics channel of my solver. Okay, so if we look at the information, the coin is being fed into my dynamic replicator. Every replica of our coin is now going to have a dynamic tag associated with it. If we select that component inside of our schematic, you can see that the properties of our dynamic replicator are identical to a dynamic tag that we'd find on a normal item. Of course, we can change the collision type, which we're going to leave for hull. We can also change the bounciness, the stickiness of all of these elements. And let's just change this a little bit here. We'll leave it at its defaults, and then if we need to tweak it, we'll tweak it here in a minute. And then once that information has been processed by our dynamic replicator, it's fed into the particle simulation, and it's also fed into the solver, which is going to make it bounce around pretty entertainingly. Let's just take a look. Yes, that's what I'm after. Wonderful. Now, if you look very closely, all the coins are laying on top of each other, and we can very quickly create the illusion that we're after, this is so cool. This is so fantastic. Okay, so let's stop the simulation right there and take a look at what we can do with this next. Because now that we've created a particle simulation that creates dynamic replicated coins inside of our scene, we need to be able to capture these. At the end of the day, I don't want to have a very processor-intensive dynamic simulation influencing the model, the sculpture of our little treasure chest. In the long run, these little coins aren't going to move. They're always going to be on the inside of the chest. So really what I'm after in all of this is a point cloud. I just need to extract the current vertex information or the vertex location of each one of the particles that were created by the radial emitter. And it's very, very easy to do this. Let me show you how. The first thing we have to do is run our sim, and I'm going to put my end time to, I don't know, we'll leave it at 120, but I'm going to do maybe 120 frames of pre-roll. Let's let it think about it for a second. Here we go. It doesn't take long. This would probably be a little bit quicker on your end. I'm working off of a laptop, but I'm also doing some screen recording simultaneously, so that's absolutely going to influence, the performance of the dynamics engine. Here we go. Almost done. Wonderful. Okay, and now let's just go to the last frame. All I really care about are these coins in here, and I just want to preserve all of these little points, all the particles in their current location. It's very easy to do this. Just make sure your particle simulation is selected, and we can preserve the current location of all of those particles and bake them into a permanent item very easily by going to the top of the screen where it says Dynamics, and then we're going to go Convert Particle Cache, and check it out. We have particles to cloud. Let's go ahead and click on it. It's going to create a new element within inside of our scene called point cloud. And now, basically, all this other stuff in here is no longer necessary because we've saved all of the particles that we created with this simulation with all of these parameters influencing it into a permanent mesh item. Let me show you what that looks like. I'm going to turn the visibility of my particle simulation, my dynamic replicator, the solver, the emitter, and the dynamic collider off. And with my mouse cursor in the OpenGL viewport, I'll hit the O key, and under the Active Meshes section, I'll turn on Show Verts. Let's turn off my replicator, and check it out. And let's turn off my bottom dynamics. There it is. Now, those are permanently saved. All those verts are the points. Now, the current configuration of all these vertices is dependent on which frame of your timeline that you were currently kind of sitting on when you saved all the information. So be selective, find a frame that you really like, and then convert all this element into a point cloud. From this, check it out. We can change the way our replicator system is working. Now, we no longer want to use down here, we no longer want to use the particle simulation as the input for a particle source, so I'm going to disconnect it, okay? I want to use my point cloud, so I'll bring that down here into my schematic, and the output of my point cloud is going to be input for my particle sim, and you can see that we get exactly what we are after. Pretty fantastic. Now, we have some particles up here that we would need to take that we need to manage. But luckily for that, it's really, really easy. I'm going to go to my point cloud mesh item and just invert mode here. I want to just deselect these, hit the backspace key, and now I can go in and select maybe these little stragglers here that are just kind of hanging out. We don't want any of these or any of those or any of these guys down here. Whoa, got a whole bunch down below. So luckily I just delete the ones that are unneeded, which are plentiful. There we go. Hit the backspace key, and what I'm left with is just the points right around the opening of my treasure chest. Okay, pretty cool. I want to turn off the visibility of my verts. I want to show you one other thing that I think you guys may find very, very helpful getting all these little elements into the scene here. Okay, what if you don't want to have, or what if you have a coin that you want to move, like that one right there, or maybe you want to, have a slightly different effect, and we don't want to move all of them. We only want to move maybe one or two. Okay. Now, I've changed my viewport to look at the model section just to make it a little bit easier. And right now, it's only showing me the bounding boxes for each one of my replicas. You can very easily change this by going into your viewport properties. Under Drawing and Control, you'll have a replicator section, and we'll just do Selected. There we go. So there they all are. Wonderful, looking good. And now, let's go in and make some changes to the location of each one of these verts, or maybe just a couple verts. I'll select that little vert right there, and you can note that, let's change my action center off. I can move these around. I can move that particle and get them into position, but watch what happens when I rotate them. Nothing. We can't rotate a particle, okay? We can't rotate a vert. However, we can change its position. To rotate our verts inside of our scene, we have to go over into our Lists tab. And let's just go check it out. Here's our lists tab, and specifically into the particle map section of our lists. And we have a special particle map that was created for us called transform. This transform list will allow us to very easily go in and, with it selected, rotate our particles. There we go. There it is a little bit. The rotation angles are a little bit funky, but you can do it, okay? Yeah, there we go. Now it's kind of behaving the way I want it to behave. Excellent. Let's turn the top and bottom of my treasure chest back on. And I think what I'm going to do is just grab all of my particles. There we go. Just middle mouse button, make sure I get them. And check it out. I'm just going to move them up. Move them up. And with that transform map selected, I can scale them out some to make them fit the widest opening inside of the thing. There we go. Wonderful. Let's go back into the setup world. Yeah, awesome. That's a good start. With some additional fine-tuning and some editing of some of these ones on the outside, I can create a very compelling result extraordinarily quickly. It's just a fast, easy way of generating some coins and maybe even some goblets without having to go in and place all of them by hand. I'm much more open to the idea of editing a point cloud very quickly than placing each one of these by hand. It makes the process go extraordinarily fast. So that's how we created the treasure on the inside of our treasure chest. I hope that you explore this idea. I think it's going to be a fun one. This gives us a lot of options going into the next section. Okay, we're not done with our treasure yet. But if you don't want to have pure geometric items inside of our scene, we absolutely could maybe preserve all this in a displacement map or even a normal map. Actually, the height of all of this is a little too much for a normal map, but it gives us some options if you don't want to have geometric replicas for all these coins and these goblets, okay? You want to be able to create a scene quickly with this system. It's a great old school trick that I've been doing forever, and it gives us some very compelling results quickly without a lot of fuss and fuss. Now, at the conclusion of this, once you're happy with all the location of your particles, you're more than welcome and encouraged to delete all of your particle simulations, your replicators, this bottom dynamic section. Those aren't needed anymore. Those were simply temporary placeholders to get us to this final result. Now, if I wasn't teaching, if I wasn't explaining all this, this would be like probably a 5-minute process. I'd definitely spend more than 5 minutes placing all of these individually by hand. So it's starting to look very, very cool. I'm pleased with the result. As always, if you have any questions, just don't hesitate to ask. You know where to find me, and I'll do my best helping you troubleshoot your scene. Thanks, everyone.